Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and yes, we are back with more Edgar Allan Poe, The Rue Morgue. I know I'm behind. Whatever, dude. I don't care right now. I'm just trying to get back on footing. On footing. Anyway, let's jump into this, shall we? Woo. Anyway. You kept your eyes upon the ground, glancing with a petulant expression at the holes and at ruts in the pavement. So I saw you were still thinking of the stones until we reached a little alley called Lamartine, which has been paved by way of experiment with the overlapping and riveted blocks. Here your countenance brightened up, and perceiving your lips move, I could not doubt that you murmured the word stereotomy, a term very affectedly applied to this species of pavement. I knew that you could not say to yourself stereotomy without being brought to think of atomies, and thus of the theories of Epicurus. And since, when we discussed this subject not long ago, I mentioned to you how singularly, yet with how little notice, the vague guesses of that noble Greek had met with confirmation in the later nebular cosmogony. I felt that you could not avoid casting your eyes upward to the great nebula in Orion, and I certainly expected that you would do so. You did look up, and I was now assured that I had correctly followed your steps. But in that bitter tirade upon Chantilly, which appeared in yesterday's Musée, the satirist, making some disgraceful allusions to the cobbler's change of name upon assuming the buskin, quoted a Latin line about which we have often conversed. I mean the line, perdidit antiquum litera prima sonum. I had told you that this was in reference to Orion, formerly written Urian, and from certain pungencies connected with this explanation, I was aware that you could not have forgotten it. It was clear, therefore, that you could not fail to combine the two ideas of Orion and Chantilly. What made you combine them I saw by the character of the smile which passed over your lips. You thought of the poor cobbler's immolation. So far you had been stooping in your gait, but now I saw you draw yourself up to your full height. I was then sure that you reflected upon the diminutive figure of Chantilly. At this point I interrupted your meditations to remark that as, in fact, he was a very little fellow, that Chantilly he would do better at the Theatre des Varietés. Not long after this, we were looking over an evening edition of the Gazette des Tribunaux when the following paragraphs arrested our attention. Extraordinary murders. This morning, about 3 o'clock, the inhabitants of the Quartier Saint-Roch were roused from sleep by a succession of terrific shrieks, issuing apparently forth from the fourth story of a house in the Rue Morgue, known to be the sole occupancy of one Madame la Espagnier and her daughter, Mademoiselle Camille l'Espagnier. After some delay, occasioned by a fruitless attempt to procure admission in the usual manner, the gateway was broken in with a crowbar, and 8 or 10 or more rough voices in angry contention were distinguished and seemed to proceed from the upper part of the house. As the second landing was reached, these sounds also had ceased, and everything remained perfectly quiet. The party spread themselves and hurried from room to room. Upon arriving at a large back chamber in the fourth story, the door of which, being found locked with the key inside, was forced open. A spectacle presented itself which struck everyone present not less with horror than with astonishment. The apartment was in the wildest disorder, the furniture broken and thrown about in all directions. There was only one bedstead, and from this the bed had been removed and thrown into the middle of the floor. On a chair lay a razor besmeared with blood. On the hearth were 2 or 3 long and thick tresses of gray human hair, also dabbled with blood and seeming to have been pulled out by the roots. Upon the floor were found 4 Napoleons, an earring of topaz, 3 large silver spoons, 3 smaller of métal d'argent, and 2 bags containing nearly 4,000 francs in gold. The drawers of a bureau which stood in one corner were open and had been apparently rifled, although many articles still remained in them. A small iron safe was discovered under the bed, not under the bedstead. It was open, with the key still in the door, and it had no contents beyond a few old letters and other papers of little consequence. Of Madame l'Espagnier, no traces were to be seen, but an unusual quantity of soot being observed in the fireplace, a search was made in the chimney, and, horrible to relate, the corpse of the daughter, head downward, was dragged there from it, having been thus forced up the narrow aperture for a considerable distance. The body was quite warm. Upon examining it, many excoriations were perceived, no doubt occasioned by the violence with which it had been thrust up and disengaged. Upon the face were many severe scratches, and upon the throat dark bruises and deep indentations of fingernails, as if the deceased had been throttled to death. After a thorough investigation of every portion of the house, without further discovery, the party made its way into a small paved yard in the rear of the building, where lay the corpse of the old lady, and her throat so entirely cut that upon an attempt to raise her, the head fell off. The body, as well as the head, was fearfully mutilated, the former so much so as scarcely to retain any semblance of humanity. To this horrible mystery there is not as yet, we believe, the slightest clue. The next day's paper had these additional particulars. The tragedy in the Rue Morgue. Many individuals have been examined in relation to the most extraordinary and frightful affair. The word affair has not yet in France that levity of import which it conveys with us, but nothing whatever has transpired to throw light upon it. We give below all the material testimony elicited. Pauline de Bourg, laundress, deposes that she has known both the deceased for 3 years, having washed 4 of them during that period. The old lady and her daughters seemed on good terms, very affectionate toward each other. They were excellent pay, could not speak in regards to their mode or means of living, believed that Madame L. told fortunes for a living, was reputed to have money put by, never met any persons in the house when she called for the clothes or took them home, was sure that they had no servant in employ. There appeared to be no furniture in any part of the building except in the 4th story. Pierre Moreau, tobacconist, deposes that he has been in the habit of selling quantities of tobacco and snuff to Madame L'Espanaye for nearly 4 years. Was born in the neighborhood and has always resided there. The deceased and her daughter had occupied the house in which the corpses were found for more than 6 years. It was formerly occupied by a jeweler who underlet the upper rooms to various persons. The house was the property of Madame L. She became dissatisfied with the abuse of the premises by her tenant and moved into them herself, refusing to let any portion. The old lady was childish. Witnesses had seen the daughter come 5 or 6 times during the 6 years. The two lived an exceedingly retired life, were reputed to have money, had heard it said among the neighbors that Madame L. told fortunes, did not believe it, had never seen any person enter the door except for the old lady and her daughter, a porter once or twice, and a physician some 8 or 10 times. Many other persons, neighbors, gave evidence to the same effect. No one was seen as of frequenting the house. It was not known whether there were any living connections of Madame L. and her daughter. The shutters of the front windows were seldom opened. Those in the rear were always closed, and with the exception of the large black room, 4-story, the house was a good house, not very old. Isidore Musset, gendarme, deposes that he was called to the house about 3 o'clock in the morning and found some 20 or 30 persons at the gateway endeavoring to gain admittance. Forced it open at length with a bayonet, not with a crowbar, but had little difficulty in getting it open on account of it being a double or folding gate, and bolted neither at bottom nor top. The shrieks were continued until the gate was forced, and then suddenly ceased. They seemed to be continued until the gate was forced, and they seemed to be screams of some person or persons in great agony, were loud and drawn out, not short and quick. Witness led to the way upstairs. Upon reaching the first landing, heard 2 voices in loud and angry contention. The one a gruff voice, and the other much shriller, a very strange voice. Could distinguish some words of the former, which was that of a Frenchman. Was positive that it was not a woman's voice. Could distinguish the words sacre and diable. The shrill voice was that of a foreigner. Could not be sure whether it was the voice of a man or a woman. Could not make out what was said, but believed the language to be Spanish. The state of the room and of the bodies were described by this witness as we described them yesterday. Henri Duval, a neighbor and by trade a silversmith, deposes that he was one of the party who first entered the house. Corroborates the testimony of Musset in general. As soon as they forced an entrance, they reclosed the door to keep out the crowd, which collected very fast, notwithstanding the lateness of the hour. The shrill voice, this witness thinks, was that of an Italian. Was certain it was not French. Could not be sure that it was a man's voice. It might have been a woman's. Was not acquainted with the Italian language. Could not distinguish the words, but was convinced by the intonation that the speaker was an Italian. Knew Madame L. and her daughter. Had convened with both frequently. Was sure that the shrill voice was not either of the deceased. Odenheimer, restaurateur. This witness volunteered his testimony, not speaking French, was examined through an interpreter. Is a native of Amsterdam. Was passing the house at the time of the shrieks. They lasted for several minutes, probably 10. They were long and loud, very awful and distressing. Was one of those who entered the building. Corroborated the previous evidence in every respect but one. Was sure that the shrill voice was that of a man, of a Frenchman. Could not distinguish the words uttered. They were loud and quick, unequal, spoken apparently in fear as well as in anger. The voice was harsh, not so much shrill as harsh. Could not call it a shrill voice. The gruff voice was repeatedly "Sacre diable," and once "Mon Dieu." Jules Mignon, banker of the firm of Mignon et Fils, Rue de Lorraine. She is the elder Mignon. Madame l'Espanaye had some property, had opened an account with his banking house in the spring of the year, 8 years previously, made frequent deposits in small sums, had checked for nothing until the 3rd day before her death, when she took out in person the sum of 4,000 francs. This sum was paid in gold, and a clerk went home with the money. Adolphe Lebon, clerk to Mignon et Fils, deposes that on the day in question, about noon, he accompanied Madame l'Espanaye to her residence with the 4,000 francs put up in 2 bags. Upon the door being opened, Mademoiselle L. appeared and took from his hands one of the bags, while the old lady relieved him of the other. He then bowed and departed. Did not see any person in the street at the time. It is a by-street, very lonely. William Bird, tailor, deposes that he was one of the party who entered the house. Is an Englishman. He lived in Paris 2 years. Was one of the first to ascend the stairs. Heard the voices in contention. The gruff voice was that of a Frenchman. Could make out several words, but cannot now remember all. Heard distinctly "Sacre" and "Mon Dieu." There was a sound at the moment as if of several persons struggling. A scraping and scuffling sound. The shrill voice was very loud, and louder than the gruff one. It is sure that it was not the voice of an Englishman. Appeared to be that of a German. Might have been a woman's voice. Does not understand German. 4 of the above named witnesses, being recalled, deposed that the door in the chamber in which was found the body of Mademoiselle L. was locked on the inside when the party reached it. Everything was perfectly silent, no groans or noises of any kind. Upon forcing the door, no person was seen. The windows, both of the back and front room, were down and firmly fastened from within. A door between the 2 rooms was closed, but not locked. The door leading from the front room into the passage was locked with the key on the inside. A small room in the front of the house on the 4th story at the head of the passage was open, the door being ajar. This room was crowded with old beds, boxes, and so forth. These were carefully removed and searched. They were not an inch of any portion of the house that was not carefully searched. Sweeps were sent up and down the chimneys. The house was a 4-story one with garrets, mansardes, a trapdoor on the roof, and nailed down very securely, did not appear to have been opened for years. The time elapsing between the hearing of the voices in contention and the breaking open of the room door was variously stated by the witnesses. Some made it as short as 3 minutes, some as long as 5. The door was opened with difficulty. Alfonso Garcia, undertaker, deposes that he resides in the Rue Morgue, is a native of Spain, was one of the party who entered the house, did not proceed upstairs, is nervous and was apprehensive of the consequences of agitation. Heard the voices in contention. The gruff voice was that of a Frenchman. He could not distinguish what he said. The shrill voice was that of an Englishman. Is sure of this. Does not understand the English language, but judges by the intonation. Alberto Montane, confectioner, deposes that he was among the first to ascend the stairs. Heard the voices in question. The gruff voice was that of a Frenchman. Distinguished several words. The speaker appeared to be expostulating. Could not make out the words of the shrill voice. Spoke quick and unevenly. Thinks it was a voice of a Russian. Corroborates the general testimony. Is an Italian, never conversed with a native of Russia. Several witnesses recalled here testified that the chimneys of all the rooms in the 4th story were too narrow to admit the passage of a human being. By sweeps were meant cylindrically sweeping brushes, such as are employed by those who clean chimneys. These brushes were passed up and down every flue in the house. There is no back passage by which she could have descended while the party proceeded upstairs. The body of Mademoiselle Espanaye was so firmly wedged in the chimney that she could not be got down until 4 or 5 of the party united their strength. Raoul Dumas, physician, deposes that he was called to view the bodies about daybreak. They were both then lying on the sacking of the bedstead in the chamber where Mademoiselle L. was found. The corpse of the young lady was much bruised and excoriated. The fact that it had been thrust up the chimney would sufficiently account for these appearances. The throat was greatly chafed. There were several deep scratches just below the chin, together with a series of livid spots, which were evidently the impressions of fingers. The face was fearfully discolored and the eyeballs protruded. The tongue had been partially bitten through. A large bruise was discovered upon the pit of the stomach, produced apparently by the pressure of a knee. In the opinion of M. Dumas, Mademoiselle Espanaye had been throttled to death by some person or persons unknown. The corpse of the mother was horribly mutilated. All the bones of the right leg and arm were more or less shattered. The left tibia much splintered, as well as the ribs of the left side. Whole body dreadfully bruised and discolored. It was not possible to say how the injuries had been inflicted. A heavy club of wood or a broad bar of iron, a chair, any large, heavy, and obtuse weapon would have produced such results if wielded by the hands of a very powerful man. No woman could have inflicted the blows with any weapon. The head of the deceased, when seen by the witness, was entirely separated from the body and was also greatly shattered. The throat had evidently been cut with some very sharp instrument, probably with a razor. But we'll go ahead and end this episode there. So yeah. It's getting interesting. We're getting the details that have been provided in the newspaper as to the death of these two women. Which is what our original two protagonists had read. But, yeah. So we see a number of incidents. There are some things agreed upon with her death, with the death of the two women. But you notice there's always a level of discrepancy. There's always something off. And what I think we're seeing here, all these people had gathered at once. And they're of all different nationalities and stuff, because it's in a very metropolitan part of Paris. I think that's where it's supposed to be. I know it's in France, but I think the actual story itself takes place in Paris. But yeah, which means it may be Rue Morgue, but I say Rue Morgue. I wasn't sure how this was. I don't speak French. I just understand by other words and how they have been pronounced in the past that I've experienced, and try to use that. So because honestly with French sometimes it just seems like let's throw in 5-6 vowels and only pronounce 2. No offense to the French. Just, yeah. Sometimes the language is like, you can cut quite a bit out of the word. But yeah. So, you are having the witnesses of the different nationalities point out that it might be someone of a different nationality they're hearing. Now, this event's at night. Who's to say what they're hearing isn't just those from the crowd? You know, because you're hearing yells and stuff. And even inside, I don't think things are quite as they appear. Simply because I may be completely wrong on this, but I don't know if they were directly murdered. I'm getting just this weird feeling that it's one of these weird coincidence moments in which they both die, but it wasn't a murder. Something's happened where the daughter tries to get up into the chimney to fix something. Because remember, they're the kind of people very reckless. They don't tend to go out. They don't have much in the way of communications. But yeah, they're setting everything up to seem as if someone robbed them for money, because they've already talked about 4,000 francs. So it's money she had put aside for a long time, and then she takes this huge chunk out. And I don't think it was like an attempted robbery or murder. I don't know why, but something just tells me that we're looking at an accident here. Now, again, I don't know. I've never read this particular short story of Poe's. But, yeah. Everything just says to me, there's something fishy going on. But yeah, right now we're going through interviews with the witnesses as seen by the police. Interviewed by the police, but yeah. So, 15 pages left. I'm kind of curious as to how this might end. And as far as the blood and gore, I again, never read this, so I wasn't aware of how gory it may have gotten. Speaking of, the mother Sand's head and the other situations. I know some people, they freak about that a lot. Like, oh, that's so gory. Why didn't you warn us? I didn't know. I may put a notice at the beginning of this episode. Potential disturbing moments. in crime scene description. But yeah. Again, something just tells me as part of the twist that it was all an accident. But yeah, we'll continue with this short story in the next episode on Poe here. But yeah, pretty good. Anyway, as always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something that you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then,